1 Corinthians 14. I mean, 1 Corinthians 13. Oh my gosh. My daughter woke me up at 4:49 today, and I am spent. All right, verse 13, chapter 13, verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Keep in mind that a lot of people take 1 Corinthians 13, they isolate it from the context of the letter. If you are new to reading the Bible, the chapters, as broken up like you see here, are for our benefit so that we can reference more easily. But Paul is writing a letter to the Church of Corinth. He doesn't break his letter up into chapters. So this is a one flowing letter. So if you look at the very last verse of chapter 12, it says, "But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you still more excellent way." And then the first sentence in chapter 14 is, "Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts." So you need to read chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians in the context of spiritual gifts. I know a lot of people pull chapter 13 to use it as the definition of love, and it's like the love chapter or whatever, but I mean, it is, sure, the way of love. It's speaking about that, but it flows in reference to not just love, but in the context of spiritual gifts and desiring spiritual gifts. And when we read on, you'll see what I mean. Let me just start over. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have, tongues, spiritual gifts, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. These people in Corinth, if you remember reading in chapter 12, the people of Corinth have gifts, but in the church they were arguing about which gifts were best, or saying that I am more loved or closer to God because I have this gift, and why did you give this person that gift? And they were sort of disputing about which gifts were more important, and sort of raising themselves up over the church if they had a particular gift that they felt was more important. And Paul is saying in the beginning of chapter 13 that all of these gifts are nothing if you don't perform the gifts in love. So if you have the gift of prophecy, but you don't have love behind that spiritual gift, it's nothing. I am nothing. And they didn't have love in performing their gifts because they were arguing about the gifts, saying, my gift is better than your gift. Does that sound like somebody that's lovingly prophesying over the church? No. They were boastful, which brings us to our next verse here, verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. That's how they were about the gifts. Boastful of their gifts, envying other people's gifts. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So this is he's defining what love is, and the gifts need to be performed in love. This verse 6, it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth, and love bears all things. So have you ever had an argument with your husband and then you brought up something that he did like 6 years ago? Holding on, there's resentment there. It's telling you, and this word for love in chapter 13 is agape. There's a few different, if you look at the Greek translation, if you look at the Greek and Hebrew translations, there's 3 different kinds of love, I think. There's love that's like spouse love, which is where we get the word erotic from, eros something love, I don't know. Then there's the friendship love, phila something or other, which the Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, that's where that comes from, is that kind of love, like a friendship love. And then there's agape, which is what is being used here, is the word agape. And this love is totally unconditional and is not selfish in any way. And that's the kind of love we are called to have. And we can't have that kind of love on our own, because being in the flesh, we don't operate that way. But because we have the Holy Spirit in us, we have the ability to love like God is telling us to love, because we have the Holy Spirit inside of us. So if you think that you just can't let go of this thing that your husband did so many years ago or last week, let it go. And also what I wanted to say about that is, if you hold things against people, or, you know, usually it's in a long-term friendship or with your spouse, you hold a grudge, or you remember this wrongdoing that they did. If you don't just forget it. Seriously, just forget it and move on. Because if you don't, you're not allowing them to change. You're assuming they haven't changed. You're pinning them into this person that they used to be a long time ago. Who's to say all the praying you've done this whole time hasn't changed them? And here you are holding something against them that they, you know, it's not even relative. It doesn't even relate to the situation anymore. So just honestly, if you have a friend that made you mad, or your spouse made you mad, try to let it go, okay? I'm not saying to become a doormat, obviously. Like, please, let's just have some common sense here. But this is what I do with my husband. If he does something that I'm just, oh my gosh, I cannot believe, right? I think to myself, am I going to stop loving him for this? Am I going to want to leave him? Is this going to ruin us? And I think to myself, no, I still want to be with him for the rest of my life. I let it go. I don't, we've had arguments, and then I say to him, what the heck was that? Can we just erase the last 20 minutes? And we don't even revisit it. Sometimes, especially when you've got 4 very small children like we do, you're just spent, and then you just kind of act in the flesh. You act like however you act, you know, when you're not operating in the Spirit, and you're just kind of being a foul person, and then you just need some grace and some forgiveness. And not everything needs to be thoroughly hashed out. Obviously, if it's an ongoing argument, you need to talk through that. But like, there's moments where we've just been like, sorry about yesterday morning. Can we just let that go and move on? And we do. And that's what I encourage you to do, because love is not irritable or resentful. Being able to love despite their flaws, that's the kind of love we're told to have for others. Not even just your spouse, but for your neighbor, for the people you don't even know. Verse 8, love never ends. As for prophecies, this is part of the Bible that people use to say that the gifts are not in play anymore, because when we learned in chapter 12, there's some people that think that the gifts no longer are for today or whatever. But I don't know. I don't think that... well, I'll show you why. Verse 8, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. What is the perfect? When the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. That's what people use to say that gifts are no longer in play, because they think that the perfect was the Bible being written and completed, and it is. It's been canonized. You cannot add or take away from this word, so they think that that's what the perfect is referencing. Some people think that the perfect is when Jesus died on the cross. A lot of people assume different things about the word perfect here. Let's read on. Verse 10, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. That could be confusing, but this is one thought tied together. Just because it's separated in verses doesn't mean that it's separate thoughts. It's all in context of gifts, and it's all in context within the writings here. He's saying, but when the perfect comes, the partial will not pass away. Then the next couple sentences is about partial. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. That's like a partial knowledge. But when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. He's giving examples of partialness and fullness. And remember, that's in reference to when the perfect comes. The partial will pass away. He said, when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Well, what's the partial? Here it is. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So, would you say, even as I have been fully known, that's a reference to, I can't remember where it is in the Old Testament, but that's how God knows every hair on your head. God knows every thought before it even comes out of your mouth. Do you know yourself like that? No. So we are still in the partial bit of knowledge. When the perfect comes, comma, the partial will pass away. So I don't think the perfect has come. Therefore, I don't think the gifts are gone. Because if you read this entire thing in context, it doesn't read that way. It says, when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Here's what the partial is. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So once we know fully, like God knows us fully, that's when the perfect comes, and that's when the partial passes away, and that's when we don't need gifts anymore. But he's saying here, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Love is going to go with us beyond, like when we're dead and gone on this earth, we will still have love. We won't need faith and hope anymore because, you know, faith is for what we have not seen, and hope is for things we don't have yet, but it will all be fulfilled, right? And it'll make perfect sense. And I think that's when the perfect comes. The partial pass away. And because we still don't know ourselves, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. I don't know myself fully. Like God knows me. God has me fully known, right? So if you read it in context, reads to me like we still have gifts. Okay, so, I mean, you can disagree, but we're going to continue on in 1 Corinthians 14 if you stick with us here, and we'll talk more about gifts, because 14 is about gifts also, okay? I will talk to you guys soon, God willing.